So
Yeah.
let's go with the immoral first. Make the case that white identity politics are immoral.
Well, not every aspect of white identity
Yeah,
politics
yeah,
is
okay,
immoral,
sure,
but
but you do disagree morally with
yeah.
some aspects. Yeah.
So a big part of white identity politics, uh, as it's discussed, for example, on social media these days, is repatriation or remigration, as it's sometimes
Yes.
called. Now, the term is used to mean slightly different things. Some people use it to just mean deporting people who are in the country illegally, which
Right.
I'm not
Which,
against. In fact, I
yeah,
think that's what the rule of law demands. But others use it to mean deporting people who are here legally, and even people who were born in the relevant countries, and who even whose parents were born in the relevant countries. Right, but deporting them because they have a different racial background.
right.
Yeah, that seems to me immoral and wholly inappropriate, and indeed extremely unlikely to ever happen on a large scale anyway.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, no argument from me on that. It would be, I mean, I see fantasies about inducing people with monetary reward or something. Uh, but it seems clear that this would require intolerable amounts of coercion. And also, we're talking about citizens in many cases, right? So we're talking about coercing citizens to go to countries in which they were not even born.
That's right.
Yeah,
And uh, yeah, some people in the relevant categories may still have links to their ancestral homelands.
sure.
They may still have family there, but others will not have any links. And
Right.
so it's not even necessarily true that you're deporting them to a culture in which they would fit in well. But yeah, as you said, uh, some people argue that financial inducements and cutting welfare would be sufficient to encourage
Right.
large-scale self-deportations. But
Yes.
I think this is a pipe dream. If you look
But I
at
mean,
Denmark, for example, which has actually a policy of encouraging people to self-deport or repatriate with financial incentives, the numbers involved are tiny.
right,
It's several hundred people a year.
right,
In contrast to these tens of thousands that are often arriving from the from the countries of origin. So
right.
you're getting several hundred people to self-deport while accepting tens of thousands more.
Yeah, and I would point to the failure of colonization in the United States. So some of the founders who were opposed to slavery on principle, Jefferson in his sort of more lucid moments on the topic, Monroe, etc., even Lincoln early on at least, were they favored colonization, the idea that you would move blacks to Africa, freed slaves to Africa, where you get Liberia.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert certainly on the history there, but it didn't work. And at that time, we would have tolerated much more coercion than we would today. So I just don't see that that's feasible. And it's not only it's not feasible, and also it's reprehensible in my view. Like it's that immoral.
Yeah, I mean, I would add also that I have non-white friends and who are citizens of Western
Right,
countries. I don't want them to
right.
be deported,
Yes,
obviously. Uh, I even have non-white people in my family. Um, but so yeah, so it's just really never going to happen on any large scale.
right.
Um, and even if a policy of that kind were implemented, it would likely be ineffectual.
Right. So you and I agree if white identity politics means repatriation, I am strongly opposed to it. There are lesser versions of it, let us say, or I think we could argue more moral versions of it that are more congruent with liberalism, or at least with a sort of amount of freedom we would consider acceptable. So what are those versions? And
Yes.
I think you still think they're immoral or possibly unworkable.
Yeah, well, another alternative policy that some advocates of white identity politics believe in is forming a white ethnostate.
Right.
um, through voluntary mechanisms. For example, maybe there's a movement in the US for whites to move to a particular state or region within a state and establish a kind of white commune there, and with the goal of perhaps eventually seceding from the US. And along the same lines as this community in South Africa called Orania,
Hmm.
where white South Africans have formed a white community separate from the rest of the population. In that particular case, it, it makes more sense. I mean,
Hmm.
the demographic situation is tilted heavily against the whites, and there is evidence of you know targeted attacks against them, uh, against the farmers, for example.
Right.
So my position on white ethnostates is that they're not necessarily unethical because they could be established through entirely voluntary means. It doesn't appeal to me personally. I have no particular interest in joining one of those communities. But yeah, I wouldn't put it in the same category as repatriation.
Okay.
I wouldn't put it in the same moral category. I would put it in a similar plausibility category. I don't think it's going to
Sure.
happen.
We're still talking with white ethnostate, or the fantasy of white ethnostate. Again, if some people want to pursue these experiments, I have about the same attitude you do. I mean, in some cases, it might be morally legitimate, but it seems that that's still an extreme form of identity, white identity politics. You would agree, because like one could argue in favor of, say, Catholic identity politics, and very rarely would that amount to the creation of a Catholic sub-state in, say, the United States somewhere, right?
Well, there is that book, the Benedict
There
option
is.
by Rod Dreher, but maybe
Yes.
it's not representative of Catholic political
Yeah.
thought.
I mean, most people who advocate, promote like some form of identity politics do it within a pluralistic society at this point. So they are not, in fact, advocating the creation of whatever identity group, a state for that identity group, right?
So you'd argue that I've slightly strawmanned white identity politics by focusing on the more extreme policy proposals.
No, not necessarily. I think you're right to say some people who promote white identity politics promote these policy proposals, and you're right to, criticize them or point out that they're not feasible for most of the Western civilization. Uh, I'm just saying there are much less extreme versions of white identity that I think are defensible, and we'll get to those. So is there another, I forget if you addressed a lesser version even as separatism, I suppose, although that's white net that ends
Yeah.
up with
So
an, yeah.
the other policy that I mentioned in the article was like freedom to discriminate racially.
To listen to the full podcast, become a subscriber at aporiamagazine.com.